The morning shift at Buckingham Palace began like any other Tuesday for James Mitchell. He had been serving as a royal guard for 6 years.
How long enough to know every corridor, every hidden passage?
In every room that housed the most sensitive documents in the British monarchy. His boots clicked against the marble floors as he made his rounds through the East Wing, checking locks and ensuring everything remained secure during the quiet hours before the palace came alive with staff and visitors. James took pride in his work. Unlike some of the younger guards who saw their position as merely ceremonial, he understood the weight of responsibility that came with protecting not just the physical safety of the royal family, but their privacy and secrets as well. He had signed more non-disclosure agreements than he could count, each one reminding him that what he saw and heard within these walls could never leave them that morning. His supervisor had assigned him to the records room on the 3rd floor. It was a tedious job that most guards tried to avoid. The room was dusty, filled with filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, containing everything from old correspondence to legal documents spanning centuries. A pipe had burst in the adjoining room the night before, and maintenance needed access to check for water damage. James's job was simple: stand guard while the workers did their assessment and make sure nothing was disturbed or removed. He unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights. The fluorescent bulbs flickered before illuminating rows upon rows of cabinets, each labeled with dates and categories. The air smelled of old paper and leather bindings. James positioned himself near the entrance, watching as 2 maintenance workers in navy coveralls entered with their tools and moisture meters. The workers moved methodically along the far wall, checking behind cabinets and along the baseboards. James's mind wandered as he stood there, thinking about his daughter's upcoming birthday and whether he could afford the bicycle she had been begging for. His wife had been picking up extra shifts at the hospital, but money was still tight. Perhaps he could ask about overtime opportunities. One of the workers called out that they needed to move a cabinet away from the wall to check behind it. James nodded his approval and watched as they carefully pulled the heavy furniture forward. As they did, something fell from the top of the cabinet, fluttering down like a leaf in autumn. It landed at James's feet, a manila folder that had clearly been wedged between the cabinet and the wall. It's forgotten, or perhaps deliberately hidden. James bent down and picked it up. The folder was thick, stuffed with papers that threatened to spill out. There was no label on the front, nothing to indicate what it contained. He should have simply placed it on top of the cabinet and reported it to his supervisor. That would have been the proper protocol, but something made him pause. The folder had a certain weight to it, both physical and somehow metaphorical, as if it were whispering that it contained something significant. He glanced at the maintenance workers. They were busy with their inspection, paying him no attention. James opened the folder just slightly, telling himself he only wanted to see what section it belonged to so he could file it properly. The first page was a family tree, intricately drawn with names and dates connecting various branches. At the top, in elegant script, was a name that made his breath catch. Camilla Parker Bowles. James knew he should close the folder immediately. This was exactly the kind of document he was meant to protect, not read. But his eyes had already begun scanning the page. Following the lines that connected Camilla to various aristocratic families, nothing seemed unusual at first. Everyone knew she came from an upper-class background. But then his gaze traveled down one particular branch, a line that seemed to have been added in different ink, perhaps at a later date. His heart began to pound as he read the names. There, buried in the genealogical records, was a connection that seemed impossible. According to this document, Camilla's bloodline traced back through a series of relationships that included a name James recognized from history books. It was a connection that, if true, would raise questions about legitimacy, about heritage, and about secrets that had apparently been kept for generations. James flipped to the next page, his hands trembling slightly. There were letters, photocopies of correspondence between palace officials and genealogists. The dates ranged from the early 20th century to as recent as 15 years ago. Someone had been investigating this, documenting it, perhaps trying to verify, or perhaps trying to bury the information. The letters used careful language, never stating anything directly. But the implications were clear to anyone who understood the delicate nature of royal lineage. One letter in particular caught his attention. It was from a genealogist to a palace secretary, dated 1997. The genealogist wrote about discovering church records in a small village that suggested a connection that had never been officially acknowledged. The letter ended with a recommendation that the findings be sealed and that no further investigation be pursued in the interest of avoiding scandal. James felt sweat forming on his brow despite the cool temperature of the room. He was holding something that could potentially shake the foundations of the monarchy. The file contained DNA analysis results, old photographs with handwritten notes on the back, and what appeared to be sworn statements from individuals whose names had been redacted. Every page he turned revealed another layer to a story that had been carefully constructed to remain hidden. A noise from behind made him jump. One of the maintenance workers had dropped a tool. James quickly closed the folder, clutching it against his chest. His mind raced with questions. How had this file ended up wedged behind a cabinet? Had someone hidden it there deliberately, or had it simply been misfiled years ago and forgotten? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do with it now? The proper procedure would be to hand it over to his supervisor, who would pass it up the chain of command until it reached whoever was responsible for such sensitive materials. But James had been around long enough to know how things worked in the palace. Once he handed over the file and reported that he had looked inside, even briefly, his career would effectively be over. He would be transferred to some remote duty, watched constantly, perhaps even dismissed on some minor pretext. The palace protected its secrets fiercely, and those who stumbled upon them rarely fared well. He could put the file back on top of the cabinet and pretend he had never opened it. But he had already seen the contents. That knowledge was now in his head, and he could not unsee what he had read. Besides, if the file was important enough to have been hidden, someone would eventually come looking for it. Questions would be asked about who had been in the room, who had access. The maintenance workers finished their inspection and informed James that there was no water damage in this section. They packed up their tools and left, leaving him alone in the records room with the folder still pressed against his uniform. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the rows of cabinets, each one holding who knew how many other secrets. The palace was built on secrets, layers upon layers of them, carefully maintained to preserve the image of stability and continuity that the monarchy represented. James walked slowly to the window and looked out over the palace grounds. Tourists were beginning to gather near the gates, cameras ready to catch a glimpse of anything royal. They saw the pageantry, the tradition, the fairy tale. They did not see the complexity, the human frailties, the difficult decisions that had to be made to maintain that image. He thought about his own family, his daughter who believed in princesses and happy endings. What would she think if she knew that real royalty was far more complicated than the story suggested? He made his decision. James walked to the cabinet where the file had fallen from and carefully examined the top. There was a slight gap between the cabinet and the wall, and when he looked closer, he could see dust patterns, suggesting something had been wedged there for quite some time. He placed the folder back in that gap, positioning it exactly as it must have been before. Hidden from casual view, but discoverable if someone knew to look for it as he did so. His hand brushed against something else tucked in the same space. Another folder, this one smaller and even older, judging by its yellowed edges. James hesitated, then pulled it out as well. This one had a name written on the tab in faded ink. Edward. His pulse quickened as he recognized the potential significance. Could this be related to the other file? Were there more secrets hidden in this forgotten space? Before he could open the second folder, his radio crackled to life. It was his supervisor, asking for a status update on the records room. James quickly responded that the maintenance check was complete and the room was secure. He was told to lock up and report to the main security office for his next assignment. There was no more time to investigate. James stood there holding both folders, torn between his duty and his curiosity. Between following protocol and understanding the truth of what he had discovered, the weight of the decision pressed down on him. Whatever he chose in this moment would have consequences that rippled far beyond this dusty room. He could feel it in his bones, a certainty that his life had just arrived at a crossroads. And whichever path he chose would change everything. James made a split-second decision that would haunt him for days to come. He pulled out his phone, knowing that bringing any recording device into sensitive areas was strictly forbidden, but reasoning that he might need evidence of what he had found. His hands shook as he quickly photographed several key pages from both folders. The camera's shutter sound, seemingly as loud as gunfire in the quiet room. Each click felt like a transgression, a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in him. After capturing images of the most significant documents, including the family tree, the genealogist's letters, and what appeared to be DNA test results, he carefully placed both folders back in their hidden spot behind the cabinet. He positioned them exactly as they had been, even disturbing the dust in the same pattern. If someone came looking, they would find everything undisturbed. But now James carried copies of information that could potentially destabilize the carefully maintained public image of the royal family. He locked the records room and made his way down the corridor, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had discovered. The documents suggested that Camilla's ancestry included a line that connected to the royal family in ways that had never been publicly acknowledged. More troubling were the notations about how various palace officials over the decades had been aware of this connection and had actively worked to keep it concealed. The question that burned in James's mind was simple. Why? Throughout the rest of his shift, James moved through his duties mechanically, his body performing the familiar routines while his thoughts remained fixed on the hidden files. He checked his phone obsessively during breaks, looking at the photos he had taken, trying to piece together the full story from the fragments of information. The more he studied the documents, the more questions arose. There were references to other files, to testimony that had been sealed, to investigations that had been quietly terminated. When his shift ended, James did not go straight home as he usually did. Instead, he found himself walking through London, needing time to think, to process what he had learned. He wandered past the Tower of London, that ancient fortress that had held so many secrets over the centuries, where royals had been imprisoned and executed, where the crown jewels sat locked away under constant guard. The whole city seemed to be built on layers of hidden history, just like the palace where he worked. His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. It was his wife Claire, wondering why he was not home yet. James told her he had stopped to pick up something, a weak excuse that she accepted without question. He hated lying to her, but how could he explain what he was going through? How could he burden her with knowledge that might put their family at risk? That night, James barely slept. He lay in bed next to Claire, listening to her steady breathing, watching shadows move across the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the family tree, the connecting lines, the names that should not have been connected. He thought about what those documents meant. It's not just for Camilla and the royal family, but for the institution of the monarchy itself. How many other secrets were hidden in those filing cabinets? How many other truths had been carefully buried to maintain the illusion of an unbroken, legitimate line of succession? The next morning, James reported for duty feeling exhausted and anxious. He had decided that he would keep the information to himself, delete the photos from his phone, and try to forget what he had seen. It was the safest course of action, the one that protected his job and his family. But fate, it seemed, had other plans as he entered the palace. He was immediately pulled aside by his supervisor, a stern man named Harrison, who had been with the royal household for over 20 years. Harrison's face was grave as he informed James that there had been an incident. The records room had been accessed during the night by someone who should not have had clearance. Security footage was being reviewed, and all guards who had been in that area recently were being questioned. James felt his blood run cold. Had someone discovered that the files were missing? Or had someone else been looking for those same documents? Harrison led him to a small office where two men in suits were waiting. They introduced themselves as palace security investigators and began asking James detailed questions about his time in the records room the previous day. What had he seen? Had he touched anything? Had he noticed anything unusual? James answered carefully, describing the maintenance check and the fallen folder. He admitted picking it up, but claimed he had only glanced at it before placing it back without reading the contents. The investigators exchanged looks that James could not read. They asked if he had taken any photos, removed any documents, or discussed what he had seen with anyone. James denied everything, his heart pounding so hard he was certain they could hear it, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. The investigators dismissed him, but instructed him to remain available for further questions. As James left the office, his legs felt weak. He knew that palace security had sophisticated methods for discovering breaches of protocol. If they checked his phone records, if they examined the security footage more carefully, they would know he had used his phone in the records room, something that was absolutely prohibited. For the next 2 days, James lived in a state of constant fear. He deleted the photos from his phone and cleared every trace he could find. But he knew that digital forensics could recover almost anything. He jumped every time his radio crackled, expecting to be summoned for another interrogation. His wife noticed his distraction and anxiety, but attributed it to work stress, something he had dealt with before during particularly tense periods at the palace. On the third day, as James was patrolling the South Gardens, his radio came alive with an urgent message. He was to report immediately to the private offices in the royal apartments. This was highly unusual. Guards of his rank rarely entered the private areas unless there was an emergency or a special security detail. His mouth went dry as he acknowledged the message and made his way through the palace, his mind racing with possibilities. None of them good. He was met at the entrance to the private wing by a senior aide he recognized, but had never spoken to. The aide, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an unreadable expression, led him through elegantly decorated corridors that few people ever saw. They passed portraits of past monarchs, priceless artwork, and furnishings that represented centuries of wealth and power. Finally, they stopped before a carved wooden door. The aide knocked once, then opened the door and gestured for James to enter. His training took over, and he stepped inside with his back straight and his face neutral, even though his insides were churning with anxiety. The room was a private sitting area, decorated in soft blues and creams, with large windows overlooking the gardens. And there, standing by the window with her back to him, was Camilla, the queen consort herself. James had seen her many times from a distance during his years of service. But he had never been this close, never been alone in a room with her. She turned slowly to face him, and he was struck by the intelligence in her eyes, the weariness that seemed to weigh on her shoulders. She was dressed simply in a cream blouse and navy trousers. Without the formal attire or jewels that she wore for public appearances, she looked like what she was, a woman carrying heavy burdens. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Camilla studied him with an intensity that made James want to look away. But his training kept his eyes forward, his posture correct. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, with none of the warmth she displayed in public. She asked him if he knew why he had been summoned. James replied that he did not, maintaining the fiction that he was simply following orders. Camilla moved away from the window and sat in one of the upholstered chairs, gesturing for James to remain standing. She told him that she knew about the files he had discovered, that security had indeed found evidence of his breach of protocol. James felt his career, his future, crashing down around him. But then she said something that surprised him. She told him that she had personally intervened to stop the investigation, that she had ordered the files destroyed, and that, as far as official records were concerned, nothing unusual had occurred in the records room that day. James struggled to process what he was hearing. Why would she protect him? Why would she acknowledge the existence of files that were supposed to be secret? Camilla seemed to read his confusion and continued speaking. She explained that those files had been a source of anxiety for her for years, that she had known about their existence but had never been able to locate them. Various officials had assured her they had been destroyed decades ago, but she had always suspected they still existed somewhere in the palace's vast archives. James walked out of the private wing in a daze, the envelope clutched in his hand feeling heavier than it should. The aide who escorted him remained silent, her face betraying nothing about what had just transpired. As they moved through the corridors, James's mind replayed every word of his conversation with Camilla, analyzing the implications, trying to understand the full scope of what had been offered. and what was being asked of him in return. When he reached the guard quarters, James locked himself in a bathroom stall and opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was indeed a letter of commendation, praising his dedication and discretion during his years of service. There was also a transfer notice to a position in the security detail for the Royal Art Collection, a prestigious assignment that came with a 30% salary increase. But it was the third document that made his breath catch. A confidentiality agreement that spelled out in precise legal language what he could and could not discuss about his discovery. The agreement was comprehensive and binding. It prohibited him from discussing the contents of any documents he may have encountered during his duties, from sharing any information about private conversations with members of the royal household, and from making any public statements about matters of royal genealogy or history. The penalties for violation were severe: immediate termination, loss of pension, and potential legal action. At the bottom was a line for his signature. It's witnessed by a palace legal representative. James sat on the closed toilet seat, paper spread across his knees, and tried to think clearly about what he should do. The practical part of his mind, the part that worried about mortgage payments and his daughter's education, saw this as an opportunity. A better position, more money, and security for his family. All he had to do was sign a paper promising to keep quiet about something that was not really his business anyway, but another part of him, the part that had been raised to value truth and integrity, rebelled against the idea of becoming complicit in covering up historical facts. Those files contained real information about real people and real connections that had been hidden for generations. By signing this agreement, he would be perpetuating that cover-up, becoming part of the machinery that kept inconvenient truths buried. Was that who he wanted to be? He thought about what Camilla had said about the burden of secrets, about how the monarchy required certain truths to remain hidden. He understood the pragmatic reasoning behind it. The royal family's legitimacy rested on carefully maintained narratives about bloodlines and tradition. Revelations about complicated ancestral connections could undermine public confidence, fuel tabloid scandals, and provide ammunition for Republican movements that wanted to abolish the monarchy altogether. In that sense, keeping secrets was not just about protecting individuals, but about preserving an institution. Yet James could not shake the feeling that there was something fundamentally wrong about suppressing historical truth. The people in those documents, the ancestors whose relationships had been deemed inappropriate and covered up, they had been real human beings whose stories mattered. They had loved, married, had children, and built lives, only to have their connections erased from official records because those connections were inconvenient. Did they not deserve to be remembered accurately? His phone buzzed with a text from Claire, asking if he would be home for dinner. The normalcy of the question pulled him back to his immediate reality. He had a family to support, responsibilities that extended beyond abstract questions of historical truth. Perhaps Camilla was right that some secrets needed to stay buried, not because the truth was dangerous in itself, but because revealing it would cause more harm than good. Who would benefit from knowing about genealogical connections from generations ago? And who might be hurt? James emerged from the bathroom and returned to his locker. Inside, he kept a small notebook where he occasionally jotted down thoughts and observations during his shifts. He pulled it out and began writing, trying to capture the essential facts of what he had discovered before they faded from memory or were distorted by time. He wrote about the family tree, the letters from genealogists, the DNA evidence, and the pattern of cover-ups that stretched back decades. He did not know what he would do with this information, but some instinct told him to preserve it as he wrote. A fellow guard named Thomas entered the locker room. Thomas had started at the palace around the same time as James, and they had become friendly over the years. Thomas noticed James writing and joked about him keeping a diary. James forced a laugh and closed the notebook, slipping it into his jacket pocket. The casual interaction reminded him that he was not alone in this place, that there were others who might be watching, reporting back to supervisors, or simply being curious about unusual behavior. That evening, James sat at his kitchen table with the unsigned confidentiality agreement in front of him while Claire prepared dinner. She asked about his day, and he gave vague answers about routine patrols and paperwork. His daughter, Emma, bounced into the room with a picture she had drawn at school, a colorful scene of a princess in a castle. She asked if princesses were real, and James told her that yes, there were real princesses. But their lives were more complicated than the stories suggested. Claire glanced at the fishy-looking documents on the table and asked if everything was all right. James told her about the transfer and the raise, presenting it as good news without mentioning the confidentiality agreement or the circumstances that had led to the offer. Claire was thrilled, immediately calculating how the extra money would help with their finances. How they could afford better things for Emma, maybe even save for a proper vacation. Her happiness made James's heart ache because he knew. It was built on his silence about something significant. After dinner, after Emma had been put to bed, James sat in his small home office and stared at his computer screen. He had recovered the deleted photos from his phone using software he had found online. The images were still there, evidence of what he had discovered, proof that the files had existed. He could still expose the truth if he wanted to. He could send the photos to journalists, historians, or genealogists who would know what to do with them. The information would spread, the story would break, and the hidden connections would become public knowledge. But then what? His career would be destroyed. His family would face scrutiny and possibly retaliation. And for what purpose? To reveal that Camilla's ancestry was more complicated than official history suggested? To prove that the royal family had covered up inconvenient genealogical connections? These revelations might generate headlines for a few weeks, but would they really change anything fundamental about the monarchy or British society? James thought about all the other secrets that must be hidden within palace walls, all the other files tucked behind cabinets or locked in vaults. If he exposed this one truth, he would be choosing to prioritize it over the well-being of his family, over his own future, over the stability that institutions like the monarchy provided. Camilla had called truth a luxury that the monarchy could not afford. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps every functioning institution required some level of useful fiction to maintain itself. The next morning, James returned to the palace with the signed confidentiality agreement. He submitted it to the legal office without ceremony, watching as a clerk stamped it and filed it away in yet another cabinet full of secrets. The transfer to his new position would take effect the following week. Until then, he was to continue his regular duties, acting as if nothing unusual had occurred. During his patrol that afternoon, James found himself back near the records room. The door was closed and locked, but he knew what lay beyond it, what was hidden behind that particular cabinet. He wondered if the files were still there, or if they had finally been destroyed as Camilla had claimed. Part of him wanted to check, to see if there was any trace left of what he had discovered. But he knew that would be foolish. He had made his choice, signed his agreement, accepted the terms of his silence. A voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Harrison, his supervisor, who had appeared seemingly from nowhere. Harrison commented that James seemed distracted lately and asked if everything was all right. James assured him that everything was fine, that he was just tired. Harrison studied him for a moment with an expression that suggested he knew more than he was saying, then told James that working at the palace required certain qualities: discretion, loyalty, and the ability to see things without really seeing them. It was a skill that separated good guards from great ones, he said, before walking away. The implication was clear. Harrison knew or suspected what had happened, and he was giving James advice on how to survive in this environment. See, but don't see. Know, but don't know. Carry secrets without letting them weigh you down. It was the unwritten rule of palace service, the compact that everyone made when they chose to work within these walls. James realized that he was not the first person to stumble upon hidden truths, and he would not be the last. The palace was full of people who had learned to live with uncomfortable knowledge. Over the following days, James noticed small changes in how he was treated. Senior staff who had never acknowledged him before now nodded in greeting. He was given access to areas that had previously been off-limits. During briefings, he was sometimes asked for his opinions on security matters, something that rarely happened to guards of his rank. It was clear that his encounter with Camilla and his decision to sign the confidentiality agreement had elevated his status within the palace hierarchy. He had proven himself trustworthy in the way that mattered most to the institution. His new position in the art collection's security detail officially began on a Monday morning. The work was less physically demanding than regular guard duty but required more attention to detail and knowledge of the palace's priceless artworks. James's supervisor in this new role was a woman named Margaret, who had been with the royal household for over 30 years. She seemed to size James up during their first meeting, asking him pointed questions about his understanding of discretion and his ability to handle sensitive situations. During his first week in the new position, James learned that protecting the art collection was about more than preventing theft or damage. It was about maintaining the stories attached to each piece. The official narratives about how paintings were acquired, who had commissioned sculptures, and the provenance of historical artifacts. Some pieces had complicated histories, connections to colonialism, or questionable acquisition methods. And part of his job was to ensure that unauthorized researchers did not access documentation that might complicate these narratives. James began to understand that the files he had discovered about Camilla's bloodline were just one example of a much larger pattern. The palace was essentially a museum of curated history, where certain facts were emphasized and others were quietly suppressed. Every portrait on the wall, every piece of furniture in the royal apartments, every document in the archives had been selected and presented to support particular narratives about continuity, legitimacy, and tradition. One afternoon, while conducting a routine inspection of a storage area, James found himself alone among crates of paintings that were not currently on display. He carefully opened one crate and found a portrait of a minor royal from the 18th century. The painting was beautiful, expertly crafted, but according to the notation on the crate, it had been removed from public display 30 years earlier. No reason was given, but James suspected it was because the subject's life story did not fit comfortably into the narrative the palace wanted to present. He closed the crate and stood there among the stored artifacts, surrounded by history that had been deemed too complicated or too inconvenient to share. The weight of his knowledge, both about Camilla's files and about the broader system of curation and suppression, settled heavily on his shoulders. He had become a guardian not just of physical objects but of carefully constructed stories, a keeper of secrets that ranged from the trivial to the profound. That evening, James took out the notebook where he had written his account of finding the files. He reread what he had written, checking his memory against his notes, making sure the details were accurate. Then he carefully tore out the pages, folded them, and placed them in an envelope. He addressed the envelope to himself and placed it in a safety deposit box at his bank, reasoning that if something happened to him or if circumstances changed dramatically in the future, there would be a record of what he had discovered. It was a small act of preservation, a way of ensuring that the truth existed somewhere, even if it remained hidden. James told himself that he was not betraying his agreement by keeping these notes. The confidentiality agreement prohibited him from discussing or sharing the information, but it did not require him to erase his own memory or destroy private records. This distinction allowed him to live with his decision, to feel that he had not completely surrendered his integrity even as he accepted the benefits of his silence. 6 months passed since James had signed the confidentiality agreement. His life had settled into a new rhythm, one that included the financial security he had hoped for, and the respect that came with his elevated position within the palace staff. Claire was happier than he had seen her in years, no longer worried about bills or unexpected expenses. Emma had gotten her bicycle and was taking riding lessons that they could now afford. On the surface, James's decision had brought nothing but positive outcomes for his family, yet something had changed within him. James found himself paying attention to news stories about the royal family with a different perspective. When he saw Camilla at public events, smiling and waving to crowds, he could not help but think about the conversation they had shared in that private sitting room. He wondered if she ever thought about those hidden files, whether she slept peacefully knowing they had been destroyed, or if she too carried the weight of secrets that could not be shared. His work in the art collection brought him into contact with historians and curators who occasionally visited to study pieces in the royal collection. James listened to their discussions about provenance and historical context, noting how certain questions were gently redirected, how some inquiries were politely declined. He recognized the careful dance of providing enough information to seem cooperative while protecting the narratives that the palace wanted to maintain. One day, a visiting historian from Oxford arrived to examine correspondence related to a 19th century royal marriage. The historian, a woman in her 60s named Dr. Patricia Thornton, seemed particularly interested in genealogical connections between various noble families. As James escorted her through the archives, she made casual comments about how official family trees often simplified complex relationships, how illegitimate children were frequently omitted from records, and how DNA testing was now forcing institutions to confront historical truths they had long avoided. James felt a chill at her words, wondering if she knew something about the files he had found. But Dr. Thornton seemed to be speaking generally, sharing observations from her years of research rather than hinting at specific knowledge. Still, her presence reminded James that he was not the only person who understood that royal history was far more complicated than public presentations suggested. There were scholars out there, researchers with access to church records and private collections, who were piecing together the same kinds of connections that had been documented in those hidden files. After Dr. Thornton left, James could not stop thinking about her comments. If academics were already uncovering these genealogical complexities, then perhaps the information in those files would eventually come to light through other means. The cover-up might delay that revelation but could not prevent it indefinitely. This realization made his own silence feel both more significant and less important. Significant because he was choosing not to accelerate the exposure of hidden truths, but less important because those truths seemed destined to emerge regardless of his actions. That night, James had a dream that he was back in the records room. But this time the filing cabinet stretched endlessly in all directions, forming a maze of secrets. He wandered through the maze, opening drawers and finding files about everyone who had ever lived or worked in the palace. Each file contained hidden truths, complicated stories that had been simplified or erased from official accounts. In the dream, he realized that the entire palace was built on these cabinets, that removing even one file would cause the whole structure to collapse. He woke up in a cold sweat, the dream so vivid that it took him several moments to orient himself. Claire stirred beside him, asking if he was all right. James assured her he was fine, just a bad dream. But as he lay there in the darkness, he understood that the dream had captured something essential about his situation. The secrets he carried were not isolated facts, but parts of a larger structure that depended on certain truths, remaining hidden. The following week, James was assigned to provide security during a small private dinner that Camilla was hosting for several charity organizers. His role was to remain discreetly in the background, ensuring the safety of the guests while being virtually invisible. He stood in his designated position, watching as Camilla moved gracefully among her guests, engaging them in conversation about causes she supported, making each person feel valued and heard. At one point during the evening, Camilla glanced in his direction. Their eyes met for just a moment, and James saw something in her expression that he had not noticed during their previous encounter. It was not just weariness or resignation, but a kind of acceptance, perhaps even peace with the choices she had made. She gave him the slightest nod, so subtle that no one else would have noticed, before returning her attention to her guests. In that brief exchange, James felt a connection, mutual understanding between two people who carried secrets they could not share. After the dinner ended and the guests had departed, James was walking back to the guard quarters when he encountered Margaret, his supervisor. She asked if he had enjoyed working the dinner detail, commenting that such events required a particular kind of professionalism. Then she said something that caught James off guard. She told him that everyone who worked closely with the royal family eventually learned that discretion was not about keeping secrets, but about understanding which truths mattered and which ones did not. The royal family, she explained, was human, with all the complications that came with being human. Protecting them meant protecting their humanity, not pretending they were perfect. Her words resonated with James because they offered a different framework for understanding his situation. Perhaps his silence was not about covering up scandal, but about respecting privacy. About acknowledging that everyone's family history contained complexities that did not need to be public knowledge. The files he had found detailed genealogical connections from generations ago, involving people who were long dead. Did exposing those connections serve any purpose beyond satisfying curiosity or generating controversy? James began to think about his own family history. The stories his parents and grandparents had told him about their ancestors. He knew there were gaps in those stories, relationships that were not quite explained. Children who appeared in family trees without clear parentage. Every family had its secrets, its stories that were simplified or sanitized when passed down through generations. The royal family was no different, except that their secrets were deemed more important because of their public position. One Saturday afternoon, James took Emma to visit the Tower of London. As they walked through the historic fortress, looking at the crown jewels and learning about the monarchs who had ruled England over the centuries, Emma asked him if being a queen or king was hard. James thought carefully about his answer. He told her that, yes, it was very hard, not just because of the responsibilities, but because everyone expected royalty to be perfect, to have clear and simple stories that fit into neat categories. But real people, he explained, were always more complicated than stories suggested. Emma seemed satisfied with this answer and moved on to asking about the ravens that lived at the tower. But James continued, thinking about what he had said. In trying to explain things to his daughter, he had articulated something important about his own situation. The expectation of perfection, of simple and clear narratives, was what made certain truths dangerous to reveal. It was not that the information in those files was shameful or terrible in itself, but that it complicated the story people wanted to believe about the monarchy. Months turned into a year since James had found the files. His position in the art collection security detail had become comfortable, almost routine. He knew the collection intimately now, understood the stories behind each piece, and had learned which questions to answer and which to deflect. He had become exactly what the palace needed, a loyal employee who understood the importance of maintaining carefully curated narratives. One autumn evening, James was doing a final security check of the galleries when he noticed someone standing in front of a particular portrait. It was Camilla alone, except for a single aide who stood respectfully at a distance. She was looking at a painting of one of her predecessors, queen consort from centuries earlier, who had also married into the royal family after a complicated personal history. James maintained his professional distance, but could not help observing the thoughtful expression on Camilla's face as she studied the portrait. After several minutes, Camilla turned and noticed James. She approached him, and for the second time in their acquaintance, she spoke to him directly. She commented that the woman in the portrait had faced tremendous criticism during her lifetime, had been judged harshly for circumstances largely beyond her control. But history had eventually been kinder to her. Sometimes, Camilla said, it took decades or even centuries for people to understand that the official stories were incomplete, that real lives were far more complex than the judgments made about them. James understood that she was speaking about more than the portrait. She was acknowledging the files, the secrets, the complicated truths that had been hidden without explicitly mentioning any of them. He replied that he thought history had a way of revealing important truths eventually, even when people tried to hide them. Camilla smiled sadly and said she hoped that when those truths emerged, they would be understood with compassion rather than judgment. She thanked him for his service and continued on her way, leaving James standing alone in the gallery. He looked at the portrait she had been studying, at the woman who had been controversial in her time, but was now just another historical figure. Her scandals long forgotten or reinterpreted. Perhaps that was what would happen with the information in those files. Perhaps in 100 years, the genealogical connections that seemed so important to hide now would be seen as simply interesting historical details. It's barely worthy of mention. As James locked up the gallery for the night, he thought about the sealed envelope in his safety deposit box, the record he had kept of his discovery. He wondered if he would ever retrieve it, if circumstances would ever compel him to reveal what he knew. Or perhaps it would remain there indefinitely, a truth preserved but never shared, like so many other secrets hidden within palace walls. He walked through the empty corridors toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The palace at night felt different than during the day, more like the museum of history it essentially was. Every room contained layers of stories, official accounts, and hidden truths existing side by side. James had learned to navigate this landscape, to perform his duties while carrying knowledge he could not share. It was a burden, but he had come to terms with it. When he arrived home that night, Claire and Emma were already asleep. James stood in Emma's doorway for a moment, watching his daughter sleep peacefully, her new bicycle leaning against the wall nearby. He thought about the choices he had made, the silence he had agreed to maintain, and the security it had provided for his family. Perhaps there were moments in life when discretion was not cowardice, but wisdom. When keeping secrets was not about dishonesty, but about understanding what truly mattered. James went to his small office and sat in the darkness, not turning on the light. He thought about the conversation with Camilla, about Margaret's words regarding discretion and humanity, about Dr. Thornton's observations on the complexity of royal genealogy. All of these perspectives had helped him develop a more nuanced understanding of his situation. He was not simply covering up a scandal or protecting an institution. He was making a choice about which truths needed to be public and which could remain private. The truth was that he would probably never speak about what he had found, not because he feared the consequences, though those were real, but because he had come to believe that revealing those particular secrets would serve no beneficial purpose. The genealogical connections documented in those files were historical facts, but they were not facts that changed anything fundamental about the present. They would generate headlines, satisfy curiosity, perhaps embarrass certain individuals, but they would not make the world better or more just. This realization brought James a sense of peace that had been missing since that morning in the records room. He had not betrayed his principles by choosing silence. He had simply recognized that truth was more complicated than he had once believed, that knowing when to speak and when to remain silent was itself a form of integrity. The files would remain hidden, or they would be discovered by someone else someday, or the information would emerge through other sources. But whatever happened, James had made his choice consciously and deliberately, not out of fear, but out of a genuine belief that it was the right thing to do. Years would pass. Emma would grow up and eventually learn what her father did for a living, though she would never know about that particular morning in the records room. Claire would continue to be grateful for the financial security that James's position provided. James himself would advance further in the palace security hierarchy, becoming someone who trained younger guards, passing on the wisdom he had accumulated about discretion, loyalty, and the complexity of truth. And sometimes late at night when he could not sleep, James would think about those files tucked behind a cabinet in a dusty records room. He would wonder if they were still there, or if they had truly been destroyed. He would think about Camilla and the burden she carried, about all the other secrets hidden within the palace walls, about the complicated relationship between truth and the stories institutions chose to tell. But he would not retrieve the envelope from his safety deposit box. That record would remain where it was, a testament to something that had happened, but that no longer needed to be revealed. Some truths, he had learned, were worth preserving, but not worth sharing, at least not yet, perhaps not ever.